Good evening, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of Friends and Allies, Frank Murphy and the Jewish Community in Michigan and Beyond. Just a reminder that part 3 will be taking place next Wednesday, January 19th at 7 p.m. Additionally, we have a conversation with artist Yigal and his gallery manager and daughter Shir Ozeri, hosted by JHSM Vice President Barbara Cohn on January 20th at 7 p.m. And on February 10th at 7 p.m., we'll be hearing from Charles Gallagher regarding his new book, The Nazis of Cochlin Square, The Forgotten Story of the Christian Front. And as always, these programs are supported by the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Endowment for the Arts. Before I turn it over to Greg Zipes to start part 2 of our program, I just want to remind everyone that we will be having a question and answer session at the end of the program. And I invite you to submit your questions via the chat feature in order to participate in this session. And now I'm going to hand it over to Greg Zipes for part 2 of Friends and Allies.
Good evening to everybody. I hope you had a great week, and I'm very pleased to be back to be presenting to you. The Christian Front, I see that Mr. Gallagher is going to speak on the Christian Front, and while we won't mention the Christian Front tonight, we will mention an individual who is connected to that group. So let me start by sharing my screen with you. And I'll give like a 30-second summary of what we covered last week, and then dive into the next portion of Frank Murphy's life. So I'll move ahead if I can. Okay, so this is a highly selective timeline for Frank Murphy's life. I threw a lot of dates at you the last week. Hopefully it wasn't too overwhelming. He was born in 1890 in Sand Beach, which is now Harbor Beach. When we last left Frank Murphy, he was still a local figure in Detroit. He was mayor of Detroit. Detroit was an important city, 4th largest in the country, but nevertheless, he was a local figure. And we're deep into the Depression. The federal government did not have a history of being involved with relief efforts and helping the poor and the destitute. There was massive unemployment in Detroit and around the country. And Frank Murphy was fishing for ways to get help to the people and trying to utilize city resources to get help to the people. But this was before the New Deal. It was before Franklin Roosevelt, and it was before the federal government really got involved in these things. In 1932, so again, this is right before Franklin Roosevelt is elected. The Great Depression is a couple years in by now. Murphy is the mayor of Detroit, and he realized that he needed a new financial lifeline for his city. And he had a key insight. The federal government was an obvious source of funding for cities, but there was a problem. And we have to look at this from the 1930s perspective. Today, it's presumed that the federal government will bypass states and work directly with localities and individuals. Just go to your Social Security office and you'll see that. Unemployment taxes and benefits. But in Murphy's time, it was more of a federalist system as we were taught in school. It's the states interacted with the federal government. The states had rights, and everything else was reserved for the people. That's the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. Cities aren't really mentioned in the Constitution, so cities would go through the states, and the states just were not performing. So Murphy had this idea of assembling the big city mayors. He invited them all to Detroit. They all met in 1932. The New York mayor, the Chicago mayor, all the big mayors from around the country came in. He convinced 48 mayors of cities with populations in excess of 100,000 to attend a conference of mayors in Detroit. And that conference of mayors still exists today. Murphy was the person who started them off. And he argued to them that if large cities would have a better chance of convincing the federal government to start providing support directly to them if they banded together. So we're going to see this idea of Murphy promoting the idea of entities banding together, laborers banding together. He was firmly in charge of the Conference of Mayors and stayed focused on trying to get federal aid to the cities. And he gave the keynote address there. And the mayors agreed to send a delegation to Washington to press their case. Murphy was the leader. So we're going to see him go to Washington in a little bit. But I want to mention his friend, Charles Cochlin. And we're going to talk about Charles Cochlin a little bit more. And many of you are familiar with him. And the Christian Front, by the way, when you hear that lecture, you'll probably hear his name mentioned as well. But it's important to note at this point that they were friends and that Cochlin had not yet begun his anti-Semitic tirades on the radio. And Murphy asked him to give the closing benediction at the Conference of Mayors, which he did. And this sealed their friendship. So now Murphy and Cochlin are close allies and friends, and this is going to benefit Murphy in just a little bit, as we'll see. But they decide to send a delegation to Washington, and so here's Murphy going to Washington and visiting all the senators, and this really raised his national profile. But at the time, it was Hoover. Hoover was the president. And this is one of the great what ifs of history. If Hoover had been a little bit more adept at in dealing with the mayors, such as Murphy, and maybe allocating more federal money to local problems, Murphy would have had a problem in supporting the New Deal and Roosevelt 1 year later, when Roosevelt rose to the fore as a candidate, because he was getting money from Hoover. Hoover, though, was not adept in that way. And it's not as though Hoover did not do big projects. The Hoover Dam is one prime example of where Hoover, late in the game, did start applying federal aid to build projects, put people to work and that sort of thing. But it just was a lost opportunity for Hoover and the Republicans. But they did need to deal with Murphy. And here you can see Hoover in the back here, Hoover sitting in the back, Murphy's in the front here. So we get to an important point in Murphy's life. This is a crucial time. The time was about 1932. Murphy was in New York frequently to negotiate with New York bankers over Detroit's financial fate. Detroit was in financial peril as usual, and he would constantly be coming to New York trying to negotiate with the banks. Roosevelt's estate is about 70 miles north of New York City. It's on the Hudson. It's about 10 miles from where I grew up in the mansion's in Hyde Park, New York. And this is a photo of probably Murphy's first visit with Franklin Roosevelt. They would become extremely close allies in the fight, the New Deal fight. And over here to the left is a gentleman called Hall Roosevelt. Now, Hall Roosevelt was the brother of Eleanor Roosevelt, and so he's also a more distant relative of Franklin Roosevelt, if you know the story of Eleanor and Franklin. But Hall Roosevelt was a banking expert, and he actually was hired by Murphy and lived in Detroit. And Murphy was no fool. He knew he was the brother of Eleanor, and he knew that Roosevelt was a prime candidate to be the Democratic candidate in 1932 and 1933. And we could talk here as well about Murphy's idea of the ideal America. And so there's a gentleman called Alfred Smith who ran in 1928 on the Democratic ticket. He lost to Hoover, but he was going to run again. And Alfred Smith is a Catholic, and he was half Irish. But Murphy never supported him. He always supported Roosevelt, and he would be loyal to Roosevelt if there was ever a choice between anybody else or or any policy that Roosevelt didn't support, Murphy would always support Roosevelt and his policies. And the one other thing that I love about this photo is that FDR had childhood polio, and he didn't have use of his legs. And you can see here that he's standing up, but he always has his two hands are always on something. And he just had tremendous physical strength and was able to stand up. And you could see his face, he looks very relaxed. He's under immense strain. And this is just one of the many talents of FDR. So during the election season, this is now Roosevelt running against Hoover, Murphy barnstormed for FDR, joining national figures like Senator Norris of Nebraska. And Murphy was a powerful symbol for FDR because he was not corrupt, unlike a lot of the other city mayors, and he was not part of a machine. He didn't do patronage, and he seemed to charm everybody. So when FDR won, he was appreciative of Murphy and Murphy's efforts to get him elected. We get to Charles Cochlin now and Murphy's complicated relationship with him. So Cochlin has a bad reputation as an anti-Semite, and it's very well deserved. But starting off in the 1920s and the early 1930s, he had a different reputation at the time. He was charismatic, and he noticed that the new technology of radio is something that he could use to project power and his voice across the nation, as did Frank Murphy and as did FDR. But Charles Cochlin, to give you some idea, for his Hour of Power radio show that was typically on Sundays, he had up to 30 million viewers. It's hard to know exactly how many he had, listeners on the radio. And this was in a country of 120 million. So he had enormous influence over the country. He denounced the KKK early on in his radio shows, and he denounced a lot of the capitalists and the bankers, and you could see him moving towards what would become his anti-Semitic views later on in his career. But in 1932, he came out in favor of FDR, and he said, it's Roosevelt or ruin. That was Charles Cochlin's phrase for FDR. Later in 1936, he would call it Roosevelt and ruin. He changed his slogan in 1936, but he supported the 8-hour workday, state support for the unemployed, public housing. And so his goals did line up somewhat with New Deal and FDR. But you can see here that they liked each other, and they would be lifelong friends, even as Cochlin became anti-Semitic and Murphy moved in the opposite direction. They managed to maintain their friendship. And FDR, as Cochlin started to change to criticize FDR, FDR employed Joe Kennedy and Frank Murphy to try to influence Cochlin and change his mind in that regard. And Joe Kennedy, of course, is the father of John Kennedy, the subsequent president of the United States. Joe Kennedy was one of the wealthiest men in the country, and he had an estate in Florida. Frank Murphy was a frequent visitor to this estate. And it is interesting to note that a young John Kennedy would have seen Frank Murphy visiting, and he would have seen a powerful example of a Catholic leader in the country, someone who's successful, and he might have been inspired to a certain degree by Frank Murphy. If you go to the Frank Murphy Museum, there is a signed photo of John Kennedy sent to George Murphy, who was Frank Murphy's brother. But just to be clear, Frank Murphy never adopted Father Cochlin's point of view in connection with his anti-Semitic views, and it was quite the opposite. Frank Murphy was known as a friend of the Jews and the Jewish community in Detroit and beyond. This is jumping ahead a little bit to 1938, and Kristallnacht was November 9th and 10th of 1938, before World War II, but we're approaching the World War II time period. Frank Murphy was governor at the time, and of course the Jewish community was very concerned about what was happening. They didn't have a full understanding, of course, of what was to come, but things were happening in Germany that were deeply alarming. So Frank Murphy as governor appeared at the Naval Academy, and more than 7,000 people appeared to express concern about Kristallnacht. What is Kristallnacht? They don't call it that in here, but that's what they're describing here. And Cochlin at the same time was defending the violence of the Nazi regime and argued that Kristallnacht was justified as retaliation for Jewish persecution of Christians. So you can see the two men diverging in that way. And the change was pretty stark from 1932, when Cochlin was an ally of FDR and Frank Murphy. And so we just have this diversion, dichotomy in Catholic points of view. And Frank Murphy was definitely on one end of it, in support of the Jewish community and against intolerance and violence. So I did mention that Murphy was completely devoted to FDR. And if you study FDR and his presidency, you will see people who support him initially who drop off. And he was always good at co-opting people's point of views and adopting them as his own. But there are some people that stuck with him all to the end. Not very many. Even someone like James Farley, who was his campaign coordinator, who was probably responsible for coordinating and stopping the opposition to FDR's initial run for president within the Democratic Party. He parted ways with FDR in 1940 when FDR ran for a third term. He thought that was wrong. He said it violated tradition from George Washington. We didn't have the two-term rule back then. So Murphy never questioned anything that FDR did. He was at his side and supported everything that he did. And he was asked to run by FDR for governor of Michigan in 1936. FDR was worried about Michigan. As we mentioned, Michigan was a Republican state, and Murphy was popular within the state. FDR asked him to run for governor because he thought that he could ride Murphy's coattails in Michigan and take the state that way. As it turns out, FDR won quite handily in 1936 in Michigan. He won the vote in 1936. Murphy did win as well, so he became governor in 1936, but it was a much more narrow margin, and it was going to spell trouble for Murphy. I think today the governor in Michigan runs for 4 years, but at the time it was a 2-year process. So Murphy was going to have to run again in 2 years, and he wouldn't have FDR on the ticket in 2 years. But in 1936, you can see here from this campaign pamphlet and newspaper advertisement that he just hitched his wagon to FDR. He said the New Deal is great and led to jobs, and he had no problem doing that. So FDR, if you look at his suggestions to Murphy, he loved to dabble in state politics, and he told Murphy, now that you're governor, use patronage to appoint people who are your allies, reward the state people who are Democrats. And Murphy said, no, I'm not going to do that. He appointed people who he thought were best for the job. And as a result, he alienated a lot of the Democratic base in Michigan. That was to have consequences for him 2 years later. So this is a photo of Murphy with FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt on the campaign trail. And you can see Murphy is basking in the glow of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Again, his trademark eyebrows. The Grand Rapids mayor is in front. And so Roosevelt prevailed by 300,000 votes in 1936, and Murphy's margin of victory was about 30,000. Again, that's going to lead to trouble for Murphy later on. So after Murphy was elected, but before he took office, industrial laborers started to go on strike in Detroit, Michigan. And again, remember, Detroit was the epicenter of technology, and the car companies were located there as they are today. It's still known as that, but hundreds of thousands of workers worked for the car companies in Detroit alone and other parts of Michigan. It's no accident that strikes started to break out when Murphy was elected governor. The workers were encouraged by his election, and they perceived that he would be in their corner. So 1936 and 1937, what's going to happen are called sit-down strikes, and they are what they sound like. Sit-down strikes are where workers sit in the workspace and they don't allow anybody else in. It's highly effective because then management has to make a decision if they want to move them out. Do they use violence and maybe destroy their own equipment? It's a highly effective thing, but that's what a sit-down strike is. And in 1936, December 30th, 1936, a few days before Murphy took office as governor, GM employees in the GM Fisher #1 plant in Flint began their sit down. And we saw last week, I played a clip of what was going on in Flint at the time. It was to drag on for about 7 weeks. So you can imagine Detroit in the winter. I mean, you don't have to imagine it, you just step outside and you'll see it. But that's when the strike was taking place. And so you had workers on the inside of the factories, and you had workers streaming in from different parts of Michigan and the country to stand outside of the factory as well. And then you had management hiring security forces and the National Guard as well. This was a tinderbox, and there was no roadmap for this either. The country could have really gone in a certain direction here with a lot of violence. The workers were seizing buildings and barricading doors. And so right here, you could see, this is outside of Flint, the Union Wise of Flint. You can see they have little bats in their hands, and they didn't use them as such, but they formed these lines that would prevent security guards from getting in and removing the men from the factories. And Murphy was very energetic in going around the state. Here he is in Monroe, Michigan, with some police officers. And this was a situation, there was a steel mill in Monroe, Michigan. The workers, citizens had been deputized, and they were going to go in with their guns here, although the press didn't really cover this at the time. They were going to go in with guns and remove the sit-down strikers in Monroe, and it was a real tinderbox that Murphy had to deal with. At the same time, he's a champion of the laborers, and he's worried about his legacy even now. If violence breaks out, or if he took the side of management, or he was perceived as destroying the workers with these strikes, he would that would destroy his legacy. So let me stop right here to praise the Detroit Jewish Chronicle, which can be found at the University of Michigan Library website in searchable form. And I'm going to talk about Maurice Sugar a little bit now. He was, as we mentioned, he went to the University of Michigan. He was a socialist, as that term was defined back in the 1910s. And Frank Murphy was the person who represented him in court to get him reinstated as a lawyer after he went to jail for not serving during World War I for what he thought were moral reasons. So Maurice Sugar was to play a role later on in these sit-down strikes, which we'll get to. You may hear collective bargaining, and I'll move pretty quickly through this, but collective bargaining, what is it? It's basically unions negotiating with management to come up with contracts and it assumes that there are unions in place to negotiate those, but the negotiations, now the federal government has the NLRA, which puts unions together with management, and they all talk together about rather than resorting to violence. So we're focusing on the 1937 area, and in this photo you have the sit-downers in Flint. You can see they're sitting on car chairs and they're reading newspapers, and you could also see the National Guard in Flint. They've got Gatling guns, and they're keeping the sides separate. And to give this labor unrest in the mid-1930s some context, in 2017 there were about 7 total work stoppages involving 1,000 workers or more and lasting 1 shift. But at the height of the Great Depression, there was the United States had a population of about 128 million, and there were hundreds of thousands of people out on strike, these sit-down strikes. So we'll hone in on Maurice Sugar now, who is one of the 2 major Jewish figures during the strike that I want to highlight, and who had relationships with Frank Murphy. For now, let's focus on Maurice Sugar. He was a lawyer trained at the University of Michigan, as was Frank Murphy. And as I mentioned, he was a conscientious objector in World War I. Frank Murphy had represented him in getting him reinstated to the bar as an attorney. And this was a time that, as I noted, that Frank Murphy represented someone against his own interests. It wasn't like draft dodgers were popular back then, and Frank Murphy was running for office. He represented Maurice Sugar regardless. Maurice Sugar was born in 1891, so he's a rough contemporary of Murphy. He was born in Brimley, Michigan, which is now Superior Township, the son of ethnic Jewish parents who had immigrated to America from Lithuania. And his father was a storekeeper selling general provisions. His parents were not particularly political, but he was himself. Sugar had a bit of a similar background to Murphy in that he grew up in a town with a variety of nationalities, large number of immigrants from French Canada, Sweden, Finland, and Germany. And so he grew up in a cultural mix. And it was said that while Sugar would retain a Jewish identity, he had a strong melting pot outlook based on his background. And he did easily interact with people outside his ethnic group. In this photo, you can see him in Michigan, the Socialist Society, and his wife, his soon-to-be wife, is sitting at his side. That's Jane Mayer. So Maurice Sugar was the UAW's general counsel during the strikes, and he represented up to 400,000 automobile workers as their general counsel, but he also wrote songs, and I'll play this very briefly for you. It's called the Sit Down Strike and Song, and it was sung by the workers. They actually sang the song a lot. It will get into your head a little bit, so I'll warn you now that it's like that, but I'll play it a little bit right now. Okay, so I'll move on now. Oops. So you can see that that song can get into your brain a little bit if you listen to it enough. But the sit down, as I said, these are workers who are in the factories, and they're sitting down. They're not leaving, and they were treated as heroes among other union people who looked up to them. And Maurice Sugar wrote this song to sort of inspire them. He wrote several songs during his career. This was one of them. Some of those photos that you saw from that were playing in the background as the music was playing, those are scenes from Flint. And at times you'll see windows are broken on the factory. And it's interesting to read newspaper articles about them, because newspapers will say this is vandalism. Union people will say there's tear gas fired into the factories and they had to break the windows to get the tear gas out. So there's a lot of ambiguity there, and there's a large potential again for misunderstandings and for a lot of violence. So this strike was settled peacefully. The GM strike was settled largely peacefully, and it was largely due to Murphy's work. FDR was in the background, as was Francis Perkins, the labor secretary in Washington. They let Murphy do the negotiations. They sometimes placed calls between the parties, the union people and also the GM executives. But the matter settled in late February of 1937. So it's a couple months into Murphy's job as governor. And he was lauded as a hero at the time by all sides. This was not to last, but he was lauded by the industrialists as well as the union people who loved him for settling this. There's a lot behind the settlement, and it was groundbreaking in a lot of ways. The laborers, each side had a lot to lose, and Murphy realized that, so he used that to his advantage. The workers could lose their jobs, obviously, if they lost in the strike. They could be replaced. It was still the Great Depression, and GM was not producing cars. It was the largest car manufacturer, and it wasn't producing cars. So Chrysler and Ford were zooming ahead of them in terms of car production. But more than that, labor and unions wanted to show that they could be responsible partners while standing up for their rights. And there was not a huge amount of precedent on how to settle strikes at the time. There was the thought that, again, you could send in people with guns to clear workers out. And what really emerged from this, and something that we kind of take for granted today, is that unions and management will negotiate with each other in collective bargaining, and it seems so natural today that it's hard to imagine what it was like before. This could have ended very differently if Murphy wasn't around. Returning to Maurice Sugar, this is one of those historical facts that their history helped to settle the great labor strikes. Maurice Sugar knew Murphy from the 1920s. It's now the late 1930s, and he knew the stories about Murphy's desire to help the underdog. He knew about the tall tales about Murphy's father who fought the British. These may or may not be true stories, but he fought the British, and Murphy didn't like the British, and he supported the underdogs. But Murphy also used his relationship with Sugar to push the UAW to settle as well. He reminded Sugar that in certain conversations that the country was not necessarily on board with these strikes, and they looked at them as dangerous, as unlawful, and he pushed Maurice Sugar to settle the strikes as well. So what happened was a triumph of negotiation over violence, and I told you that Murphy was willing to praise industrialists as well. I think one of his secrets was that he spread praise around, and so I'm going to just play this clip now. This is Murphy, obviously. This is Knudsen. He is a CEO of General Motors, and you're going to hear this British voice again before you hear Murphy.
But at last, Governor Murphy's perseverance paid off. General Motors agreed to recognize the UAW and not in any way to discriminate against the strikers. On its side, the union agreed to terminate the strike and evacuate all the plants.
Well, the strike has ended. Thanks to these good men who are about me here. The peace will be a lasting one because it was brought about without force and violence. I trust it will mean a new mutual atmosphere of goodwill and good faith between employer and employee.
So you can see here that Murphy, first of all, his voice, clearly a voice made for radio and TV. Another is that he spoke in these very idealistic terms. That's just the way he spoke. He was lavish with his praise of the GM executives in this. He wasn't afraid to give them credit. And I think that was one of his secrets to getting this done. Knudsen was someone who FDR then hired and was, if you read stories about him, he was actually pretty instrumental in bringing US industrial capacity up in World War II and surpassing the Axis powers in terms of industrial power. He applied the principles of the automobile industry to industries around the country. He would fly around the country and upgrade factories and employ what was the modern techniques of the car industry. And I'll give one more plug for the Frank Murphy Museum, which is in Harbor Beach. The desk where they settled these strikes is in the museum, and you could see it, and it's pretty interesting to see it. So I'll move ahead. Okay, so now we get to Mira Wolfgang, and I don't know if some of you actually met her. She had a long career. Murphy appointed Mira Wolfgang, who is a Detroit original. We see her here in this photo. She's about 23 years old at the time. And Murphy appointed her to the Michigan Employment Security Commission, which is a state agency. She had gone off to Carnegie Mellon for school, but returned when her dad needed her to work. And we're fortunate to have a record of her and to know about her, because many women in history were not written about, and there's not as much of a record. But she was important because she served as the secretary of the Detroit Waiters Local, and she organized women into unions and had them strike in Detroit and subsequently around the country. She organized the Woolworth strikes, where women would sit down and not work. And this really got into the nation's consciousness when women are in the downtown areas and they're sitting down not working. That was getting everybody's attention and really publicizing these strikes. So notice what I said. She was a union organizer, but also she was on the payroll of the state. She was on Murphy had her working for him. And this is an example of how Murphy, who projected himself as idealistic, was often manipulating levers behind the scenes. The factories workers were in the headlines, but they were out of the public areas, as I said. And Murphy had a union organizer on his payroll. Mira became known as the battling belle of Detroit, and she was famous with these Woolworth strikes, but she was to be a lifetime labor organizer and organizer of women as well. So here we see the Woolworth strikes, and the women are sitting reading their newspapers. We showed the scenes of the men reading their newspapers at the strikes in the Flint, Michigan sit-down areas. But it's a similar theme, and the Woolworth employees in Detroit struck, and it was up to 40,000 of these Woolworth people went on strike. So You can see Murphy's hand behind it. And sit downs today are not as well known in the labor field. There's legal reasons for that. They were basically banned as a technique by the Supreme Court in 1939. But so you don't see workers sitting down in factories anymore. It's unusual to see that. It's not necessarily lawful, but as a result of all these settlements and collective bargaining becoming the norm, you did see pickets and strikes outside, which were not common and are now fully accepted because of this time period. And sit downs, you'll also be reminded, Woolworth has another legacy with sit downs, and that's the Black Civil Rights Movement. And it also, if you study the Black Civil Rights Movement and the sit downs at the Woolworth counters, that was a direct result. They learned from these strikes that were taking place in Detroit and around the country, and they adopted them very consciously. So Mira was to continue to be a labor president, as said, in the Jewish community. And here is an article from the 1970s. She was instrumental in passing Michigan's 1966 minimum wage law and chaired the 1974 founding meeting of the Coalition of Labor Union Women. And interestingly enough, she didn't support the Equal Rights Amendment. She thought that the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have given women equal rights under the Constitution as an amendment, she didn't support that. She thought that working women needed more flexible time, and they would this amendment would actually hurt them rather than help them. Controversial. You could have your own opinion on that. Murphy, I'll move quickly through this, but Murphy was not completely successful in keeping things peaceful, and the Battle of the Overpass was took place in a Ford plant where union members were attacked by the security guards. And this is the way our labor system might have worked out if people like Murphy hadn't generally prevailed with collective bargaining. This might have been the way that strikes were settled. You would have parties attacking each other. And that really is not the way things worked out in the end. Luckily for the country, in my view. So Ford was late to unionize, and they didn't unionize until 1941. Maurice Sugar was involved with the unionization of Ford during the war and before the war. It's not clear that he was really focused on Ford's anti-Semitic acts, as we described before in the prior class, or if he was using that as an excuse to get the workers to unionize. But he certainly did emphasize the fact that Ford received a medal from Hitler and used that to his advantage to unionize the Ford plants later on. So again, Murphy as governor, I'll just take a brief detour here. He was appearing around the country and trying to build his national profile. He was possibly going to run for president because, as again, Roosevelt was ending his second term in 1940. You're not supposed to run for more than 2 terms as president, and it would be unprecedented for someone to run for a 3rd term. Murphy and others were trying to build their national profile, and Murphy gave a speech at Yeshiva University in New York City, where he talked about his conceptions of democracy, which I think are very consistent throughout his life. He love thy neighbor as thyself is one of his chief statements that he would make throughout his career. And he tended to not focus on his Catholicism when he was talking in public realms. He would more point to portions of the Bible that all the faiths would have common ground in. And so here he is at Yeshiva University talking about his conception of America. And very briefly, I'll talk about his relationship with his siblings. He was very close to his siblings. He didn't marry, as I mentioned before. He's a bachelor his entire life. His sister, Marguerite, was his companion. Often she appeared. She did get married later in her life, but she adored Frank Murphy and would often be his escort in public venues. They're often in photos together when he's walking off a train or something like that, as is his niece. His brother, George, was a lawyer who followed his path to a certain degree and was a criminal court judge in Detroit. His offices were used to settle the sit-down strike. Frank would camp out in Detroit in his offices to settle the strike. Very, very close family, the four siblings. And when Frank's eldest brother passed away in 1946, Frank never really recovered from that. His health issues started, and he was to pass away in 1949. So I talked about how Frank Murphy has empathy towards many different groups, but Jews had a special place in the pantheon. And I had this on the screen. It's a postcard that's kept at the Bentley Library, and it shows Murphy writing to Joan Kudoyi, one of Murphy's girlfriends. This was in 1946. So again, he's the Supreme Court justice, and it describes his visit to Jerusalem as the greatest day of his life. And he's obviously visiting Christian sites there, but he's connected to the Holy Land in this way. During one speech at Yeshiva University, which I already mentioned, he said, this is a quote from him: "We have called peace a Christian attitude, forgetting that it was a Jew who first used those words, which now belong to humanity, about beating swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks." So I don't know if I made the case as to why Frank Murphy was such an ally of labor, but the fact that he settled the strikes in 1937 and unions became established really set him as their lifetime allies. He was always pro-labor and he always supported them, but they were undoubtedly on his side, and the common working man was on his side. One of the reasons the unions settled the strike in 1937 was because Murphy said he was going to go to the factories and tell the workers to leave, and everybody knew that if Murphy said that to them, they would listen to him and leave. That would leave the unions with less power because Murphy was the one who got them to leave. So everybody understood that he had this power over the unions. Here you can see him with Truman in 1948, and you can see his famous bushy eyebrows again. So this is 1 year before Murphy dies, and Murphy was at a labor rally with Truman on Labor Day. Truman is running for president, his re-election. He's supposed to lose the election. He's running against Dewey. Things are not looking good, and he didn't like Murphy, but he didn't mind being seen around Murphy because Murphy had this constituency, the laborers, and you can see here that Murphy is kind of holding court here. It's Truman's event. He's the president, but Murphy is the one who looks like he's the politician here, glad-handing people. He's meeting his old friends in labor. This is a labor get-together. So, and Murphy is clearly having a great time at this. And as we know, Truman did win that election. He held up the headline banner the day that he won, saying "Dewey beats Truman," which was a premature headline. But Truman, so Murphy knew various politicians. Murphy was in and out of the hospital for the last few years of his life, and a few weeks from his death, Murphy actually sounded very confident about his prospects. He would say to reporters, feel this muscle. He would say that right up until the end. But he died in 1949, and his brother was at his side when his brother George was at his side. And in this photo, you can see Marguerite, his sister, and his girlfriend Joan, and his niece as well. And this is just the way he presented himself in public. He was his sister was at his side, even though he was a bachelor. There is some question about whether he was going to marry Joan in the end. He was 59 at the time, and she was substantially younger than her. She was actually an heiress of the Literary Digest. He did go around with women who were heiresses and very well educated as well. And as you can see from your Wolfgang, the photo with him, he was with younger women, he was with older women, but he was rarely with women his age, and that's something I very much noticed. When Murphy died, and I'll wrap it up with this, when Murphy died, an estimated 20,000 people viewed his body in Detroit's City Hall in a 5-hour period. And a lot of them were factory workers that came straight from their work clothes, from their shifts at local factories. Laborers fashioned their own ad hoc tributes to him as well. So here you can see this is the Detroit City Hall, and the workers are lined up, and you can see some of them are not dressed particularly in their suits. They are coming from working class pursuits, and they're going to pay tribute to him in Detroit. But the unions went on strike in honor of Murphy and everything they did for them. And they went on strike for 5 minutes, a lot of them, to show solidarity. They went silent in their factories, which was a big tribute to him. And they and FDR had gotten a 2-minute tribute, so you could see that Murphy got more than FDR when he passed away. And if any of you are by the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice, which is obviously named after Frank Murphy, you might not have known what it was named for, but Frank Murphy, there's a statue there, and it's called the Hand of God, and you can see it there. That's right next to the hall, and it's a man looking up. You can Google that and see it. But that was commissioned by the UAW. They knew what kind of inspiration Frank Murphy was. So with that, Murphy passed away, and let me just discuss a little bit about what I hope to accomplish at the next session, which is I'm trying to make these self-contained so that if you missed one of these, or if you zone out for part of it, you can pick it up in the next session. The next one I'll focus on is Supreme Court years, and I'm going to focus on Felix Frankfurter, the other ethnic Supreme Court justice at the time, a Jew. They were presented with questions of what is America, and they really did incorporate their backgrounds, their ethnic backgrounds, into their decisions. And next week, we're gonna be polling the class a little bit, the people listening to this, to see how you would respond to certain questions about how you would respond to certain questions that Murphy and Frankfurter had to answer. It's not intended to be a legal presentation by any stretch. It's just going to be use your common sense, and as an American, as a Jew, how would you answer certain things like, I'll give you an example. Should everybody be required to salute the flag when they're in public school, and some parents think that might be a violation of their religious freedoms? So should Americans, as a price for being Americans, be required to salute the flag or not? And Murphy had his point of view based on his background, and Frankfurter had his point of view. So with that, let me stop sharing the screen, and I'll ask Kara if there are questions from the group, and if I can answer them.
Just a reminder, everyone, to submit your questions via the chat feature, and we'll just wait a few minutes to see if any questions come through.
And while we're waiting for that, I will note that I had some assistance in preparing for this, and I'll give some acknowledgements next week as well. But I really valued Rabbi Victor, who a local rabbi from Poughkeepsie, who I presented some of these questions to, and he gave me his responses, which I thought were very interesting, and he incorporated Jewish values into them as well. So we'll hopefully discuss some of those in the next class.
I'm not seeing, oh, there we go. What happened from Rabbi Victor? What happened with his presidential ambitions?
Okay, so, and I didn't plant this question either. So, so Frank Murphy was touring the country in 1938. He was governor of Michigan. And as I stated, FDR was going to finish his second term. He would have needed a successor, someone who was a New Dealer, someone who was interested in his social policies and his economic policies. And FDR and Frank Roosevelt was at the top of that list. His problem was that he was a Catholic. I mean, I say that because running as a Catholic would be an issue for at the time. And Alfred Smith, who had run before in 1928, he had problems appealing to parts of the country. But I'll note that Frank Murphy had this ability to cross party lines, and the economy was not good when he would have run, unlike when Smith was running. Smith was running against Hoover. Republicans had been firmly in control of the presidency, and Hoover could argue that there's no need to change the presidency from Republican to Democrat. This time around, the Republicans didn't have that argument, and Murphy might have had a shot, but as soon as FDR said, "I'm running again," Murphy immediately abandoned his goals for presidency, somewhat to his disappointment, but he was too loyal to FDR to ever question that. So he didn't have a window to run at the end of the day.
Any other questions? Please submit them via the chat feature. Another question, was Murphy a friend of Jews as individuals or as a collective?
Yeah, it's a good question, and he, as I said, he didn't have a lot of contact with Jews early on. He's tended to help under communities that faced issues, that had that were underprivileged or that were being persecuted against, and he naturally got behind them. So while he had relations with individual Jews, and there was no evidence that he didn't want to have those relationships, I think it was more focused on the community as a whole.
Any other questions? Please submit them via the chat. We'll just wait a minute to see if any come through. I am not seeing any other questions come through, so that will be it for tonight. We look forward to seeing you all next week, January 19th at 7 p.m. for part 3, the concluding part of this program. This link that you use this evening can be used next week as well, and I will also be sending out the link again on Tuesday just to make sure it's at the top of everybody's inboxes. Thank you so much, Greg, for another fantastic session, and we will see you all next week, January 19th, for our part 3. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.